Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm actually not going to talk about production much at all. I'll start off by a couple of little thoughts about production, but I thought I'm going to leave time for a Q&A, and that way you'll get to find out exactly what you want to know about things, because otherwise I could stand up here and talk about compressors. And that's boring for me, and it might be boring for you, and if you have questions about compressors, then it won't be boring because you'll want to know something specific and you'll ask me, and we'll talk about that. But what I wanted to do was, I'll start by saying just a couple of more holistic production things, because I think being in an institution like this with the facilities they've got and the huge amount of resources for students to come in and learn production and music, it's just mind-boggling. My wife asked me yesterday, was this like what University of Miami was when you were there? And the answer is absolutely not. We had one analog 24-track studio, one analog 8-track studio. That's it. There were no computer labs. I didn't get an email address. That was it. So the progression of recording schools, and I think it's part of accepting the fact that you can teach pop music and you can also teach pop production, and that it is relevant and it's academic and it's something to learn. It is not something that you should just go off into a studio and learn. There's a lot behind it, and there's also a lot of technology behind it. But I want to get away from that and talk about one thing very briefly, and then get into my sort of slightly prepared talk. But one of the things in talking to quite a few of you who teach recording and mixing is kind of the overall concept of how do you teach students to finish a mix. It's very easy to say, well, this is how an EQ works, this is how a compressor works, and here are some ideas about how you might want to balance a drum kit and leave room for the guitars, even though you have cymbals and a lot of vocals that you're going to put distortion on. So, frequency-related things. But then how do you get a student to say, yep, my mix is done? Because, of course, working in a DAW now, you open it up and you're exactly where you left off, and you could do that for years. And I do seminars, like Weeks with the Masters, where you spend a week with people who are actually already successful in their own communities and in their own fields, but they come to these seminars to sort of learn. And one of the things they often say is, oh, I've been working on this for months, and I just don't know if it's done. So I wanted to get across this idea of having an idea. And it's, when you're composing, it sort of becomes an obvious thing. If you have an idea of the piece you're going to compose, you might get surprised along the way, or you might be inspired just by the sound your guitar made when you dropped it, and that will then inspire a composition or something like that. But there is an idea, and you move forward with that idea, and the idea can change as you go, but you're always working to realize something. And mixing, production in general, but mixing specifically, needs to be the same sort of progression of an idea. So I'm often asked, well, how do you start a mix? Do you start with the drums? Do you start with the vocal? Do you start with anything? And in terms of actually plodding through the mix, I start with drums, usually. If they're live drums, you start with them because there are way too many microphones on them, and you're trying to make it feel like one instrument and one drummer, not just a bunch of individual things that pop up. So I will start there because it's technically difficult. But before I even do that, I've got this session prep sort of ritual I go through, which is getting all the tracks in the order that I want them, color coding them in the colors that I want them. So drums always look the same, bass looks the same, and drums are at the top, and the kick drum is the first track, and the lead vocal is right above all the major parallel processing stuff, and it's orange, and I can find it. And this is a way of me just being comfortable in my own work environment. But while I'm setting that up, I'm listening. And I'm listening both to the session, the way they sent it, I'm listening to the rough mix, and it's just cycling. And it might be quiet, I might be cranking it up, but it's just to get some idea of the sort of ecosystem I'm going to work in, but not to be influenced by it, but to be inspired by it. To hear the rough mix and realize, wow, this rough mix sounds awful, which, that's a win for me, because now I know, sonically, I'll beat this in 10 minutes, that's easy. But it feels amazing. And why does it feel amazing? Well, it feels amazing because the bass is way too loud, and the bass player is by far the best musician in the band. So my mix will continue that. The bass will drive this mix. Or It's about the way the background vocals come in the chorus, because musically there's not a huge difference between the verse and the chorus, but it's this stack of background vocals, and that's where the power is coming from. And oh, there's a mellotron that's actually underneath the vocals and playing different voicings. And I want to make sure you can hear both of these things. And so an idea as simple as that is what will actually drive my mix. And having that kind of creative impetus to finish the mix is what I think allows me to be good at what I do. Because otherwise, especially as a student, what you tend to do is you say, well, I've got 36 tracks in this session, and I'm going to go through them one at a time, and each one of them is going to sound awesome. And then I'll probably be done, right? Because everything sounds great, and that's the idea of mixing, is to make it sound great. And the idea of mixing is not to make it sound great, it's to make it feel great. And that's it. That is the end game. And I think there's sayings about, oh, crappily recorded good music will always be good. I said this yesterday. But the reality is, it is about how the listener feels. And that now leads into what I'm going to hold forth about for a while, and then you'll ask me about compressors, and that'll be great. So I got this little presentation, and I often hit the wrong button and go backwards. So, given all that, at the end of the day, working on music, we'll talk specifically about music, there's only one thing that matters when you finish, and that's it. You can argue all day about what's important about a mix, but the only thing that matters is what comes out of the speakers. That is it. And if you argue with me, it's one of the few times where I will actually not really listen to your point of view about it. Because I think this is actually a fact. This is not an opinion. And the reason is because at some point, you will not be in the room and someone will listen to it. So all that matters is what they hear. Now, it doesn't matter if the kick drum is loud, it doesn't matter if the bass has any power to it. What matters is what their experience is listening to the music. And so now I'm going to go super holistic and zoom way out, and let's just talk about sound and music as a thing. So for hundreds of millions of years on this planet, because there was an atmosphere, so you had a medium that sound could travel, that's what happened with sound. So on the left we've got a speaker, but this speaker is not a speaker as we know a speaker. The speaker is a woolly mammoth, it's a thunderstorm, it's a tornado, it's anything that creates sound. Sound is the crazy chaotic thing in the middle. It's a pressure wave. It's compression and rarefaction traveling through air like a slinky or like ripples on a pond. We all know enough about sound waves to know. But it's basically total chaos, but it's slightly ordered chaos as it moves through the air. And it's affected by humidity, it's affected by temperature, it's affected by the medium it's in, travels way faster through concrete than air, but it's still a compression wave. And then eventually, it makes it into the ear canal of something, if there is an ear canal, but I don't think lizards have ear canals, do they? They just have holes. But maybe there's a canal there. I don't know enough about... Anyway. So, you have what we'll call the listener. And for a very, very long time, this is how sound works. Something made sound, and then if there was an eardrum or a hearing bone system within earshot of it, then this compression rarefaction would move what was inside the hearing mechanism in a similar way, and then that would somehow get transferred into the brain of whatever had that thing on the side of their head or the front of their head or wherever it was in the side of their body if they were a fish. And then they would experience whatever this sound was. And this goes for music as well. For thousands and thousands of years, that was it. You either saw a performance of the music or you did not hear the music. And that's it. And so this is why musical notation was such a huge advance, because now you could, instead of just with an oral tradition, teach people music, you could actually send a piece of music to somebody. You didn't have to meet them and tell them how it went and make it perform your music however badly or incorrectly, but still, you could translate music around the globe, and so culturally this is a really big thing. But it wasn't until 120 years ago-ish, I don't know, I've been giving versions of this talk for all, so my numbers are off, that someone decided, like, you know what you could do is you could make something that's a little bit like an eardrum and put it in the way of this compression wave and turn it into an electrical signal and then somehow store it. And interestingly, you would think that sort of live sound reproduction would have come before recording, because recording seems much more difficult to actually take this signal and store it somewhere and then play it back. But the reality is that the recording actually happened first, wire recorders and acoustic gramophones and things like that. So this idea of taking something, putting it in the way, it moves around in a way that the pressure wave makes it move, and then it makes a waveform, an analog thing, which now, these days, we digitize, right? We get a bunch of ones and zeros and you store them. Well, okay, that doesn't really do you much good until you can play it back. So then you take either the analog or the digital thing that you stored, and you put it through an actual speaker. Could be an earbud, could be a $1,000 thing, could be whatever. But then it remakes, as close as possible, assuming you're trying to be true to the source you recorded, remake this totally chaotic thing in the air that then hits someone's eardrum. And that is recording. So recording, for most of the history of recording even, which isn't very long, was just a delay. It was just stick a microphone in the way, capture it, and then later on we'll play it back and then you can hear it. And then the cool thing is you can play it back more than once, and you can play it back in more than one location, especially when you can start to mass produce things, which is why the LP record over the wax cylinder was such a huge advance, because you could stamp them out and get them out into the world. So the history of the recording of music is very, very brief, but it's really interesting in terms of it turning recordings of things into something that someone would value over just the thing itself. And it spawned huge areas of research into different different conductors' interpretations of classical works. The studio where I do the Mix for the Masters seminars used to be owned by a French music critic, and that was what he studied, and there are 400,000 vinyl records there, something like that. And there will be 75 recordings of a piece, and the idea is to study the interpretation. So you've got this idea of people interpreting art in terms of performance, but then you've also got this idea of, well, what is it that the listener is going to get out of it, and what's important? And so this also goes back to another concept that I'll get to in a second, which I find really interesting, which is the easy way to put it is the author intent versus the reader experience, but you can translate that into any art form. And my opinion on that has changed drastically, and I'll get to it in a second. But what's important about this is when you get to this final playback, especially when you're talking about recorded and produced music, you are not in the room to explain things. And when you're a student and you're surrounded by other students who are learning what you do, you are in this ecosystem and it's an echo chamber. Because all you do is talk about, what plugins are you using? Oh man, I love that DI, and yeah, did you know that I read this book about this record and they did this, and this is why so many bands for years would record their drummer without the cymbals and then record the cymbals, because there was one Queens of the Stone Age album where they did that, and then they decided it was a terrible idea. So they don't do it anymore, but lots of other bands do, and so you copy the process, but you get so excited about the process that you forget that when people actually listen, here are things that don't come out of the speakers. And these are the things that a lot of people talk about when they're at recording school. And it's true, you will hear, I mean, this is like the bingo in that great program handed out yesterday, of things you hear at talks. But these are things you hear at recording schools. Because this is what's important, and you'll get to the end of playing something, and they'll say, oh, was that the crowd here? But these are things that people would actually say, or after they listen, they'll say, oh man, that snare sounded amazing. How'd you do that? And the reality is, well, what that means is that nothing else really sounded very good, and you didn't like the song, because you thought the snare drum sounded amazing. So then when you get out of school and you start actually doing it for work, and this of course takes this huge layer of sort of protective umbrella of responsibility off, and now you are responsible for what you send out. And even to this day, I will start drafting emails when I'm going to send a mix to somebody. And it will start as a 4-page, well, that's exaggeration, but I'm allowed to exaggerate. Let's say 4-paragraph email. But all the reasons the mix isn't quite as good as I was hoping it would be at the beginning. And so then you get into a whole nother list of things that don't come out of the speakers. And it can be very valid, and it can be true. Like, yeah, the bass sound you got is terrible, or some of my gear is broken that I know would be perfect for this. But I've also realized that, again, this is completely irrelevant, and I need to be able to work on the mix until I can edit everything out of the email except the mix is up and it's awesome. And until I can get to that point, if I'm saying any of these things to the producer, then I just haven't done my job, and I either need to quit or I need to sort it out. And sometimes there'll be some things where I figure, you know what, this is so messed up that it must be on purpose, so I'll go with it and hope that it is what they meant. And other times you sort of keep some of these things in your back pocket because you know what the mixed comments will be, and then you can say, well, okay, I struggled because of this, but you cannot allow yourself to present the mix with this. It seems obvious, but think about any time a recording's actually go out into the world. So now think about the fact that you've got a mix that's signed off, and it's mastered, and it's going up on Spotify, and someone's going to listen to it. Are you going to send them an email every time anyone listens? You'll get some tracking data and say, oh cool, I'll email this guy because the bass wasn't recorded very well, but they'll understand, and I'll just tell them that. And obviously you cannot do that, right? And you can't do this with any art form. And I think people who work in music tend to think that a lot of this stuff is very sort of specific to them. I found the magic feedback spot. But recorded music is obviously not the only place this happens. And a really interesting offshoot is while I was putting this talk together and I'm thinking about this and I'm philosophizing and trying to abstract everything, I realized, well, there's a really obvious place in music where you live this every day, and that's in live music. If you are giving a performance and something goes horribly, horribly wrong, everybody in the room is there to witness it at that moment. And if you're lucky, you're Dave Grohl and you've fallen off the stage and you break your leg and you come up and play 2 more songs anyway, and then you're an absolute hero. If you're unlucky, you're anybody else on the planet who falls off the stage and breaks their leg and the concert's canceled, and everybody hates you. But this is a famous photo-ish, famous in that it's on the internet. And this is one of my early bosses, Michael Jackson, and this is on the Dangerous tour. So this was in '92, I believe. And everyone thinks this is a picture of him singing. Audience is super happy. This is apocryphal. The story is true, though. It's not, this picture is not taken from this moment. What he's actually doing is, we were playing a show in South America, and we were playing the song Black or White. And does anyone remember the video that preceded it? It's kind of a Back to the Future thing with a kid upstairs with a huge guitar in it. And then you run, the parents are talking downstairs, the kid's playing the guitar, then he hits this huge chord, and what happens in the video is the song starts. What happens live is there's a massive explosion. Michael runs from the back of the stage, jumps on a trampoline through the pyro, lands on the stage like this, and the song starts. What happened in Brazil was the huge explosion, off the trampoline, lands like this, crickets and tumbleweeds. Absolutely nothing happened because that song had a lot of sound effects and percussion and playback, and the band was waiting for their counting to start playing. And it was crickets and tumbleweeds. And so that's him saying, Andrew? There's nothing coming out of the speakers. And at that point, I could have grabbed a microphone and said, well, yeah, but that's because we're using a single gear, which is a $500,000 piece of gear, but it's got 600 buttons, and it's sitting right next to the pyro, and the pyro gets a gunk in there every single night, and it's like 5,000 degrees and really humid, and we're really close to the equator, and why would you expect this thing to work? But the reality is that story is just as irrelevant as these 2 lists of excuses I put up. Nobody cared. So we scrambled, switched to the backup, got the song going a couple seconds late, and it was a debacle, but what came out of the speakers was a bit of a hiccup that everybody sort of kind of noticed, but because we got through it, the crowd was like, I don't know what happened, whatever. And then we got on with life, and we finished the show, and then I crawled into the bus and curled up into a ball for a couple of days, and then soldered about 500 buttons onto this keyboard to make sure they were all working again. But this idea that you cannot explain away things. And obviously here I'm talking about something that just went horribly wrong. But there can be things that just go slightly wrong with your own composition, production, novel, artwork, anything, sculpture. You cannot say, well, I'm going to make an excuse for my art. Art is art, and whether it's good art or bad art is not up to you. It is only up to the people who listen. And this is what I was talking about before, with the idea that my opinion has changed quite a bit about the author intent reader experience thing. I used to think that that was crazy. How could it not be all about the author's intent, talking about books? They wrote the book. It's obviously about what they think it's about. And if you don't get that, then you're the idiot. But unless the author has published a book about his book to say, this is what my book is about, you have no idea. So recently-ish, I've actually completely flipped on this, 100%. I believe that while creating, your intent is the only thing that matters, and as soon as you're done, I couldn't care less what your intent is. My experience is my experience, and my experience will be different from everybody else's experience, but it is only about my experience, and that is the art part of music, it's the art part of literature, of painting, sculpture, drama, anything. Everybody in an audience will have a different experience, and I'm going to get to a pretty specific example of that in a second. So just really quickly though, back to recording. One of the things that people, especially in the music industry, tend to complain about is, well, we get this exactly how we want it. And then we send out MP3s. But the reality is, if your mix won't translate to an MP3, then it's a bad mix. It needs to work where people are listening, which means it needs to work mono through an iPhone speaker in a Dixie cup, because that's how people are listening to music. It needs to work on earbuds. It needs to work on people's stereos at home where they've got two speakers, and instead of thinking that one is left and one is right, they think one is living room and one is kitchen. You can imagine how shocked they were listening to the early Beatles recordings with the hard drive. But this is the way people consume music, and you cannot say, well, but they're consuming it wrong. That's just absolutely ridiculous, and I think this can translate into other mediums exactly the same way. I'm a huge fan of Cy Twombly, who's a very prolific, bizarre contemporary artist who died a couple of years ago. And I got really excited because there was the last volume of his catalog raisonné was coming out. Life's Works. I thought, oh, this is going to be amazing. And I actually convinced my parents to get it for me for Christmas, which is ridiculous because it's pretty expensive. But they went for it, and I got it. And I started going through it, and it's like this big. And every single painting is a red circle. Like really, with some dripping paint. It's like, okay, I love this guy, so I'll cut him a break. And by page 300, you're like, this is ridiculous. Like, is this the same painting 300 times? And you're leafing back through, and I'm like, this is the most disappointing thing I've ever seen in my life. But I went to the Tate Modern, and in their permanent collection, they're changing stuff all the time. And they've got huge galleries, and they have these sort of end galleries where you walk into a door and you can't go anywhere else. So you've got 3 walls with nothing but art. And I walked into this room, I had no idea it was there. And there were 3 of these red circles. And they were 15 feet high, 18 feet high, something like that. And I laughed out loud. It's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen in my life. And that, presumably, was the artist's intent. But until you can get in a room with it, looking at it on a website or in a catalog is useless, and you would actually think much less of the artist because of it. So this brings us to the slightly pretentious portion of our demonstration here. One of the most interesting things I've sort of discovered in this quest to try and understand how to think about and act on my intent versus what people are going to actually hear later on was looking at John Cage, because he was a great thinker about not just music, but about performance and about experience of listening and things like that. And like one of his great insights, I think, and he's not the only one, was how important the space is in music. Without rests, music sucks. It absolutely sucks. You need to be able to stop so that you can start again. You have to have space. And a lot of composers don't really think about it very much. They think about their chord structure and their melody and the rhythm within the melody, but they're not thinking about the 2 beats they leave empty at the end of the melody so that they can restart. It just happens naturally. It's a very natural thing to do without thinking about it. But John Cage's idea was, okay, I'm really interested in the space, but then he decided, well, I'm really, really interested in absolute silence. So he got into a sensory deprivation chamber. I don't remember exactly how. It was some researcher that he knew. He's like, great, I'm going to go in there and I will experience absolute silence, and then I will be able to take this forth into my work. And he got in there and realized, like, okay, hold on, what am I hearing? What am I hearing? It's like, oh, well, you're hearing the blood rushing through your blood vessels near your eardrum. You're hearing all the fluids in your body, and your ears are probably ringing a bit. And then you realize, well, there is absolutely no such thing as silence. It's impossible. There is no lack of sound. I mean, obviously, go out in space, and in the millisecond before you die, there'd be silence. But there is no silence in a medium where there can be sound. There will always be sound because we are generating it as human living things. So then, and this is, I think, where it gets interesting. There is a piece he wrote, famously 4 minutes, 33 seconds, which was debuted in 1952, which kind of shocked me. I thought, oh, it can't possibly be that old. But then again, I'm getting old, and he's been dead for a while, so it's certainly possible. But to be that conceptual early on. So the piece was debuted on piano by David Tudor, who played most of John Cage's pieces. And it was at a festival in upstate New York. And I'm now, what time is it? 12:30. We want to leave time for questions. I'm going to perform the first 2 movements of this piece. And it is for any instrument or group of instruments. And I forgot to bring an instrument, so I'll be performing it for voice. So you can read along on the score. All right, and hear the first 2 movements. We'll skip the 3rd movement. If I weren't so self-conscious, that'd be a huge power trip, wouldn't it? That's just amazing. So, I'll turn the microphone back on. Okay, most of you are probably familiar with the piece. It's not shocking. There's a great quote from, where is it? I had it. Here we go. So, at the premiere, after the premiere, John Cage said they missed the point. There's no such thing as silence. What they thought was silence, because they didn't know how to listen, was full of accidental sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering the roof. And during the third, the people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out. But what is absolutely brilliant about this piece, and for years I thought, oh my God, what a gimmick. I mean, and I love his pieces for radios, and prepared piano is one of my favorite sounds in the world. So I was a fan of John Cage, but I thought, well, this is just absolutely insane. But what he's managed to do is not only remove composer's intent completely, because there is nothing written other than a time frame. He's also removed one of the things that a lot of composers absolutely hate, which is performer and conductor interpretation. There's a great interview with John Adams where he talks about going to premieres of his pieces where he's not conducting, and some conductors found a cello line buried in the second movement and brought it out. He's thinking, God, you idiot, it's buried. And it's meant to be buried so you would concentrate on something else. So this idea of other people interpreting your work. So this is a musical piece. You can't, I mean, I suppose you could argue it isn't musical, but it is a performance piece that has nothing but listener experience, which is kind of extraordinary. It's the only piece you could possibly write that would do that, where it removes everything but the end user's experience. So I think that's quite brilliant. And what this comes back to then is this idea of that's what comes out of the speakers. And in this case, nothing comes out of the speakers, but you're probably more aware of yourself in that 2 minutes that I made you sit here in respectful silence instead of walking out. Thank you very much. Much more aware of yourself and what was going on, or the people around you, than you would have been at any other performance of any piece in your entire life up to this point. Is that a fair assessment? Oh, even that, you're just thinking about lunch, which is coming up, which is fair enough too. But the piece allows for that, and a lot of people think about lunch while they're listening to a rock show, so that's not special to this piece. So then, I've got some very complicated graphics for the next part of this, but what I want to do is take this idea of what comes out of the speakers and actually abstract it now completely out of art. Because it's very easy to apply it to filmmaking or to sculpture or any other sort of art form. But how do you actually put this into practice in your life when you're not making art? And to think about the idea of, we'll use the word speaker and audience. And speaker is anything that happens. Anything, absolutely anything at all. And audience is somebody who's forced to react to it by experiencing it. And that's it. And so, try to keep up with the graphics team. So, you've got two people in life. And we'll call one of them the speaker and one of them the audience. It's very easy to get into a situation where you're thinking horrible, horrible thoughts. And I'm sure this happens a lot more often than any of us would like to admit. Where it could be even as simple as you just thought of something really funny to say that would be so offensive you probably better not say. But it could also be you're having very dark thoughts about anybody in your life, or someone you're supposed to meet, or a meeting you're supposed to go into, or someone you're co-presenting a paper with. Not that that would happen here. Everybody's super friendly. The difference is, if you say those things, if they actually come out of you, now they're out in the universe, it doesn't matter if you explain later, wow, I'm sorry, I was in a really bad mood and I was drunk. They're out in the universe and the audience is now super, super sad about it. Right? And you cannot take that back, and that's the listener experience to your vitriol. And that's the end of it. And this, I'm making light of it because it's very easy for this to sound trite, but this is some of the best parenting advice I've given myself in the entire time I've been a parent. Because it's so easy with your children who you're used to seeing all the time to kind of not put up that barrier before the, God, why would you do your Lego that way? That's just stupid. But if you say it, it makes them sad. So much better, even if you're going to think these thoughts. I mean, I can't affect what happens inside my head. But the idea is, if you only let out sunshine, it leads to love. Of course, the parallel to this is if you think all of these thoughts and you say them out loud, you're Donald Trump. And that's that. So, hopefully that last bit, which I try and make funny to get through it, is actually the most important part of the whole thing, in a way. But now we can talk about compressors, if anyone would like. So I think we've got about 20 minutes for questions before heading off to lunch.
Thank you for a wonderful speech as well. You spoke yesterday about mixing, say, 15 songs at a time. Do you always stay within one album, or do you sometimes go, I'll mix 3 albums at a time?
Whatever I have to mix, I mix. And I will usually just go in alphabetical order through one folder, and then like, oh, right, I have to work on that too. And I'll skip over to that one. And then, because I'll tend to start at the top of the alphabet at the beginning of the day, I'll then work backwards the next day. But it's completely random, yeah, and I will work on everything. Because It's a great thing to stay in context on a record, but then it's also a great thing to completely change your context by working on something totally different. So it's all about this idea of not getting caught up in the details of what you've done. So now, I can never remember the last thing I did on a mix. And sometimes I'm shocked by how far along a mix is, or shocked by the fact that I barely started it. Like, I could have sworn I spent hours on this thing, and I haven't even finished color coding the tracks. So it's a constant surprise, but I think that makes me just stay creative, because I can't get bogged down in the details.
Thanks, Andrew. We've got another conference next week that's called, do you want to come to it? It's all pressure. It's called Workshop in Intelligent Music Production, which looks into ways to automate the mixing process. I wonder if you've got any views on that, and is that something that you would adopt in your mixing process and strategy, if such tools existed?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest, because I feel like Waves has been thinking about this, obviously, for a long time, and I've developed plugins with Waves, so I talked to a lot of their developers about things, and they would love nothing better than to come up with ways where everybody can do good mixes without necessarily knowing what the hell they're doing. And there's nothing really wrong with it. I think the thing to keep in mind about that is 80 to 90% of the records that people buy are made in Pro Tools. I think that's the stat. But Pro Tools is the fourth dog in terms of users of any of the plugin manufacturers. Like, Native Instruments couldn't care less about Pro Tools. Everybody they deal with is in Logic, Ableton, and Digital Performer, and then Cubase. So Pro Tools might be fifth by now. So that's the difference between this sort of pro record-making conglomerate thing and everybody else in the universe is actually just making music. What I learn constantly is there are lots and lots of things that I do instinctually from having mixed for 25 years or whatever it is. And I feel like, well, they're unfigureoutable, which is now a word, because I just said so. But it turns out there are lots and lots of things that I feel are unfigureoutable that there were papers on in the last 3 days. So they are figureoutable. Now, whether you can take what you figured out and apply it, I don't know. But what's really interesting to me, and I don't know if it will work towards the actual mixing plugins, something like that, is the advance in AI audio processing. So Isotope, Acusonics, companies like that who actually have plugins that they have just taught how to hear, and then the plugin makes decisions about the audio on its own. It is not programmed where if you get something in this frequency range, do this. It actually listens to the entirety of what's going through it, and then, can make decisions based on that. And those decisions are starting to get really good and interesting. So I think it is possible for this to happen, but I don't know how to quantify what happens in my brain when I'm not doing something that actually isn't creative. You know, when I'm EQing or compressing, I'm sure you can figure out what I'm doing, but when I'm deciding how to balance something, it happens over the course of 5 days in tiny increments. While I'm EQing, I rebalance or I repan. I don't know how you then distill that down and make that into an automated process, but I'm sure it'll happen.
Hi. I was just wondering when, in the mixing part, do you have a set formula on, going through the processes of each track that you end up mixing, or is it completely different with each track?
No, it's different. I mean, there are things I do a lot, but those things change. I have a mixing template that I kind of start with, but I use different stuff in it, and then I get bored, and I start to hear things that I don't want to hear the processing, I just want to hear the music, so I'll change things up. So, I'm sure it's disingenuous for me to say, oh, every mix is different, because it isn't, because you do have a process, but I don't know that the process is really easy to define. And I think the worst thing in the world you could do is what I was talking about earlier, and just go through every single track in a session. Like, take away the solo button. Don't solo anything ever unless there's like, wow, something's crazy in the low end on beat 4 of this measure, and just go through the tracks and find it. That's fine. But don't ever work on an instrument on its own, because that's not how it's going to live. It doesn't matter what it sounds like on its own. That's not how it's going to sound when you put it back into the mix. So you can do it just to discover things or to train your ears, but definitely do all of your panning and EQ and compression with the whole mix up and going, because otherwise you're just going to, it's easier to make a decision when it's in solo, but it's a decision based on nothing. So.
Some producers' concepts is kind of, okay, you're the band, you make your music, and I will record it, make it sound that sort of thing. Others get really, really involved in, sculpting the music and the structure, and are pretty much part of the band. I mean, I guess different projects that vary, but in your ideal world, where do you sit on that? I mean, really, should you be named as one of the band? And, I mean, how would that ideally work in your head, or how does that work in your concept?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because like Steve Albini wants to have no influence on the record at all. He just wants to capture what the band does. And then there are other producers who are there basically the band. And I mean, like some of my favorite producers have such a stylized sound that I recognize the production long before I recognize the artist. I'm sure I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to, as a producer, make the band's favorite record. And I've done that a couple of times where the record is bombed, but the band loves it. And to me, that's a bit of a success. Now, it means that labels don't like that. But, I mean, really, I think there are obviously different aspects to all of the jobs in the music industry. But in terms of producers, there's the administrative job, there's the psychologist job of getting through the day or whatever. But the actual producer's job, I think, is to have an opinion. And have that opinion be given weight by the band. So it really is being able to sort of join the band while you make the record. How much influence you have over the sound is different for every producer. I'm actually happy if people don't know that I've done something just by listening to it. Because I don't want to have that much of an impact on the sound. I want the band sound to come through. But at the same time, I'm never going to say, wow, I hate that, but whatever, it's what the band wants to do. I will tell the band I hate it, try to find a way to make it something that I no longer hate. But if they love it, I will defer to them and continue to hate it. And that's fine. But I will at least voice the opinion and try and steer it in a way where we're all happy.
Thank you. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about working with voice and someone like Adele, for example, when you get the sense for that. Is there any particular approach that you have with working with the voice? Has that changed over time? And the second part of my question is, do you buy into the idea that techniques can make a record sound dated in terms of its production style? And have you ever worried that any of your sounds or techniques could be perceived that way?
Well, the second half first, yes, absolutely, things can sound dated. And I think that I tend to try and keep things sounding natural unless we're going for something completely unnatural. Like, I want drums to sound like drums in a room. And that doesn't really get dated too much. So I'm not going to say that the way I do things is timeless, but I try not to be too much at a time. I don't study what's current to try and figure out, do I need to do that? I like to pretend that my sensibility is just going to stay relevant. And eventually it won't, and I will not be hired anymore. But I think I've had such a long, slow climb with my trajectory in my career that I'm confident enough that I will just continue to try and make stuff the way I like it, and that will align enough. In terms of vocal, it's a really individual thing. I mean, obviously it depends on the singer, and it really depends on not necessarily the genre, but the arrangement. How dense is the arrangement? Are you trying to sing over electric guitars, or are you trying to sing over acoustic guitars? The more natural and acoustic a song is, the less compressed I would like the vocal to be, because I think compression is awesome, and I use lots and lots of it, but I use it in a parallel way, which, just very briefly, means you've got the uncompressed thing and the compressed thing, and you blend them together, as opposed to just compressing the thing. As soon as you compress, especially a voice, but any instrument, it sounds less natural. So the most natural recording you can usually get is a really good ribbon mic in front of an instrument in an acoustic space. Because a ribbon is the lightest diaphragm of any microphone, so it moves the best in air, etc., etc. As soon as you do anything to that, even EQ, which introduces weird phase shift and things like that, it will just start to sound less natural. And to untrained ears, probably A/B things like, well, I don't know, whatever, it all sounds the same. But it goes back to the whole point of this, which is the emotional reaction when you hear it. And I feel like, especially on someone like Adele, who's got lots of dynamic range and really controls her voice, that the less you mess with that, the more that will get through the speakers and actually let people connect all the way back to her instead of it sounding like a produced recording of her. People want to be in a room with her. And so compression and EQ and effects, to me, removes me when I'm listening. So I try and keep things drier and less processed. But on a rock track, that all goes out the window, compress the hell out of it, use micro delays and pitch shifts and reverbs and all kinds of stuff to add depth and weight and whatever to make it come across.
Yeah, my question is about the importance of understanding physics, electronics, acoustics, and all those sciencey things. Because I recently discovered, or a few years ago, I started to become interested in those topics myself, and I think my production workflow took a leap from understanding that. And my question is, do you think that's important when educating sound production?
I think it's super important, and it's for a really specific reason. You're using the tool set. I mean, now it's a little bit easier, but when you were just working on analog gear in rooms, you really did need to understand a little more about the electronics, because stuff broke all the time. You had to work around it and be a troubleshooter. And the more knowledge you have, the better. But there are two sides to it. One is to get over, I said this yesterday, to get over the idea that there's any voodoo. There is no magic piece of gear. You can recreate that. And an example of it was working on one of the plugins with Waves. I was trying to match an EQ curve because I really loved the way this EQ sounded. And it was a digital EQ. It was a different plugin, but I loved like the mid-range and the way it reacted. And so we were copying it. And it was one of theirs. So it wasn't like copy. It's like, here you go. And it didn't sound the same, and it wasn't working. And instead of thinking like, well, there's just something about it, we won't be able to do it, like, no, there's something wrong. And what we found out is that on the one that I liked, they'd also modeled the transformer, which meant that there was a high-pass filter at about 10 hertz and a low-pass filter at 30K, which of course you can't hear, but we put those filters around this mid-range EQ, and we're looking at EQ at 1K, and immediately, there it was, perfect. So it's first of all to know that there isn't voodoo, so if something's not right, you know you can fix it. Now you might not have the abilities to fix it, but it is fixable and knowable and repeatable. But it's also mainly so that you have the knowledge of how the stuff you're using works, so that it can go away, it can disappear, and you can be creative. If you don't understand what your tools are doing or what's happening acoustically in a room, you go out to Mike a drum kit and it's like, God, there's no fundamental on the kick drum. You could spend hours moving the microphone, EQing, trying different microphones. All you need to do is pick up the kick drum and move it around the room. And you'll find a spot in the room where it will just, and there's your fundamental. And it's going to show up in every single microphone you put in front of it. If you leave it where it is, it will never be there. And you'll end up adding sub to it later on. So if you have no understanding of acoustics, it would never occur to you that you might need to move the drum. So it's getting enough of this sort of baseline knowledge about how everything works so that your brain thinks creatively about it. To the point where now I walk into a room and I usually can find a spot to put a drum kit, set up all the drum mics, walk back into the control room, and I never have to move anything. And it's just a weird kind of acoustical knowledge of how this stuff is going to sound. And it works on any instrument with any microphone now. But it's only because I actually know how stuff works to a certain extent. And so yeah, I think it's really, really important.
Thank you. My question is, by far, what has been your most interesting project and why?
I don't know. I mean, there are a lot that are interesting for different reasons. Like working with the Chili Peppers was a lifelong dream. Like, that's amazing. I'm halfway through producing a record for a band called Motorcycle from Norway. Okay, how many people in the room have actually heard of Motorcycle? Good God. Percentage-wise, that is so far out of the norm. But anyway, they're absolutely one of my favorite bands, and getting to sit in a room with those guys was unbelievably intense, but also just absolutely amazing. amazing. So there are things like that, but then probably one of the best experiences in the long term was a band on my label, because I was as close to an artist as I'll ever get. I played lots of keyboards, did programming, lots of modular synth treatments and things like that. I'm also the record label, I'm the co-producer, I'm whatever, I'm everything. And when he opened for Hozier for a month, and then when he got songs picked up in a video game thing, I can actually get back to the thing that probably as a kid I wanted, which was to be a guy up on stage and have people, you know, love something that you've done, and to really be able to kind of own a bit of that. And I don't pretend, I mean, it's all about Ryan and his songwriting and his voice, but of all the projects I've worked on, that's probably the one that I own the most of, and can just kind of be the proudest of, without having to say, oh, well, I only did this or that or the other thing. So, yeah.
Okay.
Here it comes.
Here it comes.
Here it comes.
I'll try not to ask too many questions. So, I want to know, a lot of the questions being asked of you, I don't know, mixing. How much are you kind of producing these days as opposed to mixing? How do you think your role as a producer has changed over the last 25 years? These are two questions. And how is that informing mixing? Are you finding doing a few more production decisions when you get set a multi-track? I don't want to use the word stems. And finally, how is the amount of time, if you're producing a record, are you still spending the same amount of time that you would have 20 years ago, like in the studio, or is it you'll find the budget's dropping and you're having to work in, you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, we'll go backwards. First of all, what budgets? I mean, this motorcycle record, we recorded over an hour of music, and it was in 11 days, and that's all the time we had. And it was full on, and not like live band picks, with lots and lots of overdubs and structure changes, and songs that had to be recorded in 12 pieces and then cut together. And so a ton of work, and we had 11 days, and we spent, I think the shortest day was 14 hours, because that's the time we had. And that's the reality of producing at this point. If you're doing music with lots of live musicians, if you're doing more desktop productions, well, your time can be almost unlimited. But if you need to be in a room with microphones and drum kits and headphone systems and whatever, then the budgets are absolutely tiny. Personally, I'm mixing probably 90 to 95% of the time now. It's almost like coming out of retirement to produce this record, in a way. But it's still something I absolutely love. And in terms of the production decisions you make while mixing, I think it was touched on yesterday that people are not as good at producing as they used to be because they're producing all over the place. So sometimes there isn't a producer. It's just the artist has put the stuff together and that's that. So while that's great that they can do that, there is an art to record making that used to be a thing, and there were gatekeepers and all sorts of really horrible things about it, but there were just people who understood what it meant to try and keep a set of 15 songs moving forward and actually getting towards the finish line where you could say, yep, this is a product. And I love the idea that the definition of what a product is expanded. It can mean anything, but at the same time, there are projects I've been hired to mix where I've actually sent them back and said, like, look, when you can do a rough mix, then I can start to mix. But you've sent me stuff, and there are 3 possible tracks of every guitar. One with a fast Leslie, one with a slow Leslie, one with no Leslie. And every amp is recorded separately for every one of these takes. And
You weren't able to get the email down.
yeah, well, I don't even know where to start. Like, I would have to make so many decisions, and I could just be wrong. You know, I don't know you have to get the artist's intent to be able to continue. Even if at the end of the day their intent doesn't matter. But I feel like I need to know where the project is going. So usually what happens is things show up and they're sort of 80 to 90% done. And that other 20% I just do as I'm mixing. Because it's obvious. It's like, well, yeah, you probably didn't want every single background vocal at the end of that chorus to have its own T at the end of the word trust. And they all happen at different times. I'll clean them up. You know, that stuff is simple. And these background vocals probably want to be super rigidly in tune. And you haven't done that, but it's going to sound really weird if we don't, because it's all thirds and it just sounds crazy. So things like that I will just do as part of the mixing. But every once in a while, and this goes back to something we touched on yesterday, is it's all about how much of a pain in the ass the people are. The more they're a pain in the ass, the more I send stuff back to them and say, hey, by the way, you want to tune those background vocals, or do you really want it to sound like this? Whereas if I like the people, I'll just do it. And that's terrible, that's me, you know, being an asshole, basically. But it's just, that's the reality of music production now. There used to be very definite stages to it, and now it's all so fluid that the mixing process, if they send it off to someone, is usually just when they gave up. And now it's like, well, we can finish it now. So, yeah, it's always different.
Yes, first of all, thank you, that was a really interesting talk. Actually, following on from what you just said, it sounds like you don't always do the pitch correction, but I'm actually really interested in sort of vocal pitch correction, to which extent you would sort of actually correct the modulation within a note and actually be quite invasive with it versus kind of leaving it natural. I suppose it depends on the genre, but...
Yeah, well, I never think about genre, and I think that's why my discography is so bizarre. I mean, I mix 99 Problems the same way I mix every rock track. You get to the chorus and it better explode, and that's it. So, I think that served me well. So I never think about that, which means I probably do stuff wrong all the time. But in terms of pitch correction or any other sort of editing, especially while mixing, is I only fix what's bothering me. And if a vocal grabs my ear 3 times while I'm mixing, I just realize, all right, I have to stop and tune it because this is going to drive me nuts. If it then turns into the whole track, then that's when you may have a conversation with the band and say, like, look, this needs tuning, and a great way to actually make the conversation go well, and it's not even true half the time, is to say, well, I have an engineer, he's super cheap, but do you want to pay him to tune the vocals, or do you want to do it? And you usually say, oh, we'll do it. But otherwise, you know, it costs him £25, and this guy who's really, really good will do it, or I'll just do it, and we won't even charge. But it really is only about fixing what's bothering you. You were talking earlier about how do you know a mix is done. For me, I know a mix is done when I can listen all the way through and nothing bothers me. Now, obviously, I would also like to love it and be just completely blown away by it, but I hate everything I've ever done, so that doesn't happen. So what it really is I've now removed all the stuff that was bugging me, and that could be an out-of-tune vocal, but it could also be, we get to the bridge and it's just not Goosebumps, like it should be floating off a cliff, and instead it's just like, and so that's a problem I need to fix. So it could be something super creative and esoteric, or it could be something super specific.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you can say hypothetically you were going for like a really highly polished, like bubblegum pop, plasticky kind of vocal sound. Would you get this not necessarily default or like sort of pitch correcting the hell out of it? You might still need it. Like,
I'd be shocked if there was something like that I was mixing that didn't come to me that way.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay,
it would be, yeah. If this is purely just as a mixer.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is something where I would come back to them and say, look, it seems as though you're going for this thing, but you've sent me this other thing, so what do you want to do about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's the worst job. I was somewhere, I was actually in Oslo at a school, and they had, it was like a Nerf cube with a microphone in it, and you just throw it around. It was awesome. Just a little Omni mic and a Nerf cube, and no one had to run around with a mic.
I want to come back to what comes out of the speakers thing. You mentioned earbuds. I mean, people listen in all kinds of environments, but probably headphones and earbuds are more dominant than they used to be. And studios used to have strategies. You have big speakers, you have the MS-10s, you have an orto, and you check different the mix on different speaker possibilities. People take the mix out and listen to it in their car. How do you know when you're finishing a mix that it's going to work in all those different environments? Do you have a strategy or just...
Yeah, I don't do what you're supposed to do. I've got one pair of speakers and I've got one pair of headphones. That's all I ever use, and that's it. But I just know them well enough that I can hear everything on them. But when you're starting out, I mean, you do need to reference on lots of things. But it's not to say, well, I want the mix to sound like this, and now I think it's awesome, but that won't work on headphones, so now hold on a second, let me go back and do something. A good mix will sound good absolutely everywhere. period. And I think testament to that is go back to any of the 50s and 60s Blue Note records and all the early Beatles stuff, and listen to that on earbuds or on your iPhone speaker, and it still sounds great. And obviously they were not mixing for this, and it wasn't remastered for it. It's just that the balance is great, and the frequency content makes sense, and it will survive losing everything below 100 hertz or everything above 12K. And that's a sign of a good mix. So my mixes will just translate. I think the difference between my mixes and, let's say, like 50s and 60s Blue Note, Rudy Van Gelder, is my stuff is a bit more unnatural because of the parallel compression. My dynamic range is much, much smaller than those mixes. And I know that, and we haven't talked about loudness for it, and we won't. But what that means is that I can hear my mixes coming out of these laptop speakers, and they will still be as aggressive as they are on big speakers. Whereas when you listen to a very natural, open sounding thing on tiny little speakers, usually you can only hear the vocal, or the sax, or whatever mid-range instrument is kind of taking it, because you need to have a decent playback system to really get how much better that mix is than the type of mix that I do. But I think my mixes will survive pretty much anything. And it's just from experience though. I think the biggest thing is, if you listen on different speakers, you're not using one set of speakers for checking out your low end and another set of speakers for your balance. What you're doing is you're changing your perspective so that you stop listening to the snare drum and MIDI and you listen to the whole mix. But the idea is, if you hear a problem on one set of speakers, make sure that you can now hear that problem on all of your speakers. And if you can't, get rid of some of your speakers. That's the idea. So you switch it up. You no longer listen to the snare drum and say, oh my god, the low mids are just going crazy on the guitars and the chorus. That's no good. You better be able to switch back to what you're working on before and still hear that problem. Otherwise, those things don't make sense. You're not really referencing anymore. So it's just a way to get your brain to listen to the whole thing.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.